January 30th, 1649. London is freezing. A man steps onto a wooden scaffold outside the banqueting house. He is trembling, not from fear, but from the cold. He doesn't want the crowd to think he is shivering with terror. This man is Charles I, the King of England, the representative of God on earth, and in exactly 10 seconds, the executioner will swing the axe. The divine right of kings died that afternoon, but the blade that killed it wasn't forged in 1649. It was forged 400 years earlier, not by peasants, but by the most ruthless tyrants in history. This is the story of a blood feud between absolute power and the law, a war that lasted 500 years, and it all began with the most hated man to ever wear a crown. England, 1199. The throne belongs to King John. History calls him Bad King John, but that is too polite. John was a sociopath in royal robes, a man who supposedly claimed the king is the law. He didn't just tax his people, he hunted them. Consider the story of Matilda de Braose. She was a noblewoman who dared to insult the king. John threw her and her son into a dungeon at Corfe Castle. He gave them a sheaf of wheat and a piece of raw bacon. When the guards opened the door 11 days later, they found the mother dead. Her cheeks were gnawed away. In her madness of starvation, she had tried to eat her own son to survive. That was the price of defying King John. But John had a weakness. He was a loser on the battlefield. The French called him John's soft sword. In 1204, he lost Normandy, the jewel of the English Empire, to the French. To win it back, he needed money, an insane amount of money. He introduced a tax called scutage. If you didn't fight for him, you paid. Tax upon tax, fine upon fine. If a baron wanted to marry off his daughter, he paid John. If he wanted his inheritance, he paid John. England was no longer a kingdom. It was a hostage situation. But you can only kick a dog so many times before it bites. The barons of England, men trained in violence, secretly met. They whispered treason. They realized that if they didn't kill the king's power, the king would kill them all. May 15th, 1215. The air is thick with tension. On one side, the armored barons, hands on their sword hilts. On the other, a seething King John. They shoved a document in front of him, a great charter, Magna Carta. It was a long, boring list of demands about fishing rights and inheritance taxes, but hidden within the ink were words that would change the world forever. Clauses 39 and 40. Listen to them closely. For the first time in human history, a line was drawn in the sand. The king is not God. The king is under the law. John smiled. He took the quill. He pressed his royal seal into the wax. Peace was restored. Exactly 6 weeks. Did you really think a narcissist like John would let a piece of parchment control him? The moment the barons left, John sent a secret letter to the Pope in Rome. He begged forgiveness. He claimed he signed under duress. The Pope agreed. He declared Magna Carta null, void of all validity forever. The war was back on, and this time it was total. The barons did the unthinkable. They invited the Prince of France to invade England and take the crown. John ran. He spent the last year of his life fleeing across the muddy countryside, his kingdom burning behind him. In October 1616, while crossing the Wash, a treacherous bay in East Anglia, the tide came in too fast. John's entire baggage train, his gold, his crown jewels, the treasury of England, was swallowed by the sea. It has never been found to this day. A few days later, King John died, not in battle, but from dysentery, shitting himself to death in a lonely castle. The tyrant was dead, but he left behind a 9-year-old son, a broken kingdom, and a piece of paper that everyone thought was garbage. But ideas are harder to kill than kings.
Fast forward 50 years. King John is rotting in his grave. His son, Henry III, is now on the throne. Henry wasn't a murderer like his father. He was something perhaps worse for a ruler. He was incompetent, and he was addicted to spending money. While his people starved in the mud, Henry was obsessed with building the most beautiful cathedral in Europe, Westminster Abbey. To pay for his project of God, he bled the country dry. Magna Carta? It was ignored. The barons were furious again, but this time they didn't just want a piece of paper, they wanted a voice. And they found it in the most unlikely man in England. Simon de Montfort, a French foreigner, a religious fanatic, a man who wore a hair shirt under his armor to punish his own flesh. He was King Henry's brother-in-law. They were once friends, but when Simon saw the king's incompetence destroying the nation, he made a choice that would kill him. He chose the people over the crown. 1264, civil war erupts. At the Battle of Lewes, Simon de Montfort did the impossible. He defeated the royal army. He captured the king and his son, Prince Edward. For 1 year, Simon de Montfort was the uncrowned king of England. But Simon knew military power wasn't enough. He needed legitimacy. In January 1265, he sent out writs calling for a great council. But he didn't just invite the rich barons and the holy bishops. For the first time in history, he ordered each county to send 2 knights and each borough to send 2 burgesses, ordinary citizens. This was the first parliament. Simon revived an ancient Roman principle, quod omnes tanget ab omnibus approbare debet. What touches all must be approved by all. It was a radical, dangerous idea, and the royalists hated him for it. Prince Edward, the future King Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, escaped captivity. He raised a massive army to hunt Simon down. August 4th, 1265, the Battle of Evesham. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution. A thunderstorm raged that morning, turning the sky as black as night at noon. Simon saw the prince's army surrounding him on the hill. He turned to his friends and said, "Commend your souls to God, for our bodies are theirs." They hacked Simon de Montfort to pieces. The royalists were so enraged by his democracy that they cut off his hands, his feet, and his testicles. They stuck his head on a spear and paraded it around the country. The king was back. Absolute power was restored, or so they thought. But here is the irony of history. Prince Edward, the man who butchered Simon, realized something crucial. Simon's invention, Parliament, was actually a brilliant way to raise taxes. To control the country, the king needed the commons. Simon died, but his idea conquered the crown.
The kings of England thought their only enemies were rebels and Frenchmen. But in 1348, a ship docked in Weymouth, carrying a traveler that respected no borders. It carried the Yersinia pestis bacteria. The Black Death had arrived. It started with a headache. Then black boils the size of apples appeared in the groin and armpits. Then you began to vomit blood. Within 48 hours, you were dead. It didn't matter if you were a peasant or a princess. The plague killed indiscriminately. In just 2 years, nearly 50% of England's population was wiped out. Imagine your city today. Now imagine half the people gone by Tuesday. Villages stood empty. Cows wandered through unharvested fields. The silence was deafening. The feudal system, which had stood for centuries, was built on the backs of cheap labor. But suddenly, there was no labor left. Basic economics kicked in, supply and demand. For the survivors, the plague was a miracle. A peasant who used to beg for work could now demand double, triple wages. If a lord refused, the peasant just walked to the next village. The lords were terrified. They passed laws to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. They tried to turn back the clock, but you cannot legislate against reality. The tension exploded in 1381. The government introduced a poll tax, a flat tax on everyone, rich or poor. It was the spark that lit the bonfire. An army of peasants led by Wat Tyler marched on London. They weren't a disorganized mob, they were disciplined. They burned tax records, they beheaded the Archbishop of Canterbury.
They demanded the end of serfdom. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman, preached the radical priest John Ball. They had the king at their mercy. Richard II, only 14 years old, rode out to meet them. He promised them freedom. He promised them pardons. He promised them everything. Wat Tyler lowered his guard. The mayor of London drew a dagger and stabbed him in the neck. The moment the rebels dispersed, the king revealed his true face. He hunted down the leaders and hanged them. "Serfs you are," the king famously declared, "and serfs you shall remain." The revolt was crushed, but the fear remained. The English nobility never slept soundly again. They knew that beneath the surface a giant was sleeping, and if it woke up again, no army could stop it. The divine right was cracking, and soon a family feud would shatter it completely.
The plague passed, but a new disease infected England, not of the body, but of the mind: madness. King Henry VI was a pious man, a gentle soul, but he was stark raving mad. He would sit for hours in a trance, laughing at invisible jokes while his kingdom burned. Nature hates a vacuum. With a weak king, wolves appeared. Two great families, the Yorks and the Lancasters, began to tear each other apart for the throne. History calls this the Wars of the Roses, but it wasn't a war of flowers. It was a war of extermination. March 29th, 1461. Towton. It is Palm Sunday. A blizzard is raging. 50,000 men clash in the snow. It is the largest, bloodiest battle ever fought on British soil. The wind blew snow into the faces of the Lancaster army, blinding them. The Yorkist archers rained death upon them. By evening, 28,000 men lay dead. The local river, the Cockbeck, didn't just run red with blood, it was clogged with bodies. Soldiers crossed the river by walking over the corpses of their friends. From this slaughter, a new king rose, Edward IV of York, tall, handsome, a warrior. But peace was a lie. Edward died young, from eating and drinking too much. He left behind 2 young sons, but their uncle was Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard is history's greatest villain. Shakespeare painted him as a hunchback monster. Whether he was a monster or just a pragmatist, one fact remains. He took the 2 young princes, his own nephews, and locked them in the Tower of London for protection. They were seen playing in the garden in June. By July, they were gone, vanished. Did Richard murder them? We still don't know. But shortly after, he placed the crown on his own head. King Richard III. He had the power, but he had lost the soul of the nation. August 22nd, 1485. Bosworth Field, the last scene of our tragedy. Richard III, the battle-hardened king, faces a challenger, Henry Tudor. Henry was a nobody, an exile who had spent his life hiding in France. He had almost no military experience, but he had one thing Richard didn't: the hatred of the people against a child killer. The armies clashed. Richard saw Henry across the field. He decided to end it with one glorious charge. He lowered his lance. He galloped straight for Henry. He killed Henry's standard-bearer. He was inches away from killing the future king. But then betrayal struck. The Stanley family, who had promised to support Richard, suddenly switched sides. They smashed into Richard's flank. The king was surrounded. His horse was killed under him. Legend says he cried out, "A horse! A horse! My kingdom for a horse!" But there were no horses, only axes. Richard III was hacked to death, the last English king to die in battle. His crown rolled off his helmet and landed under a hawthorn bush. Lord Stanley picked it up, stained with mud and blood, and placed it on the head of Henry Tudor, King Henry VII. Henry was smart. He didn't just win the war, he ended the feud. He married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of his enemy.
He took the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York and combined them. The Tudor rose was born. The Middle Ages were over, but look at the cost. 300 years of civil war, the Black Death, the slaughter of nobility. By the time Henry VII took the throne, the old feudal lords were dead or extinct. The king could no longer rely on them. He had to rely on a new class of men, merchants, lawyers, commoners. He had to rely on Parliament. The divine right of kings was mortally wounded at Runnymede in 1215. It bled out at Bosworth in 1485, and finally it died on the scaffold with Charles I in 1649. Democracy wasn't given to us by benevolent leaders. It was snatched from the hands of tyrants. It was forged in fire, plague, and blood. History is a circle. Do you think the era of absolute power is gone forever, or is it just waiting to return in a different form? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you survived this journey through the Dark Ages, destroy the like button and subscribe for more documentaries on the brutal truth of history. I'll see you in the next chapter.